My heart stopped beating for a full 3 seconds, then violently slammed against my ribs as my eyes locked onto the production schedule. The room spun, my fingertips went numb, and a cold wave crashed from my scalp to my feet. The Lighthouse Director's Cut. The $15 million prestige project personally promised to me by the studio head, now listed Ryan Matthews as lead editor. Ryan, with his 5 measly years of experience and flashy Instagram following, I'd been editing Academy Award-nominated films since before this 29-year-old visual storyteller was even born. My name is Vivian Winters. I'm 62 years old, and this is the story of how a tech corporation tried to erase 4 decades of film expertise, and how I fought back to change my entire industry. If this situation resonates with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's just a portfolio rebalancing for optimal team utilization. Vivian, my supervisor David said, corporate jargon flowing smoothly as he avoided my eyes, checking his Apple Watch, a nervous tick I'd noticed in every meeting where he delivered bad news. We need someone fluent in the current visual language for this particular project. The blood rushed to my face, hot and pulsing. My hands trembled with a combination of shock and rage. I'd started in this industry when we physically cut celluloid with razor blades and had mastered every single digital platform since. 3 major industry awards sat on my shelf at home. 7 films I'd edited had been nominated for Best Picture, generating over $1.2 billion in box office revenue. Now I was being erased while still sitting at my editing bay. This project was confirmed to me in writing, I said, my voice steadier than the earthquake happening inside me, unconsciously framing the scene with my hands, as I'd done for decades when visualizing a shot. Jonathan specifically requested me because of our work on Winter Harbor, which earned this studio its only editing nomination in the past decade. David's neck flushed just slightly above his perfectly pressed collar. Jonathan understands the studio's new direction. The metrics clearly show younger audiences respond to different visual rhythms. I'd heard variations of this explanation for months, always couched in data terminology that somehow never materialized when requested. Hollywood had always worshipped youth, but this felt more systematic than the usual age bias. The fluorescent lights made everything harsh and exposed, unlike the warm, focused glow of my editing suite. My reading glasses hung on their chain against my chest. I'd started keeping them hidden after overhearing an executive joke about grandma editors. Now I deliberately put them on, watching David's almost imperceptible flinch. I'd like to see the metrics you're referencing, I said, my voice taking on the precise measured cadence I used when identifying a problematic edit. I can have Ryan compile something for you, David replied, already moving toward the door. He's extremely proficient with our new analytics systems. Back in my editing bay, now relocated to the end of the hallway, away from the central production hub where I'd worked for 38 years, I unlocked my personal external drive. The habit of documentation had started 3 years ago when Panorama Studios was acquired by Streamverse, the tech giant determined to disrupt traditional content paradigms. Since then, I'd meticulously archived every email, meeting note, and project assignment. I'd even begun recording conversations after the first round of rebalancing, saw 3 editors over 55 suddenly reassigned to reality TV projects, despite their feature film expertise. A text notification lit up my phone. Michael Zhao, a director I'd mentored 15 years ago, heard about Lighthouse, completely unacceptable, call me. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the keyboard shortcut I'd used thousands of times to mark an edit point. Throughout my career, I'd avoided industry politics, letting my work speak for itself. But that approach assumed a level playing field where experience was valued. A knock interrupted my thoughts. Zoe Washington, a junior editor, stood awkwardly in the doorway. I was asked to get your input on this transition sequence, she said, glancing behind her before stepping in. She handed me a flash drive, then whispered, "There's also a folder with the email thread about the department restructuring. I thought you should see it." As she left, I found myself staring at an email I was never meant to see. A detailed strategy for demographic optimization of creative departments, with explicit directives to reduce staff over 55 by 30% within 18 months. The last line froze my blood. Executive bonuses will be tied to successful implementation of demographic targets. This wasn't just about my project. This wasn't just about me. This was about systematically erasing an entire generation of film professionals under the guise of modernization, with executives getting paid bonuses for how many older people they could push out the door. The question wasn't whether I would fight back, but how to frame this particular story so the truth would finally be seen. And after decades of watching human stories unfold, I knew exactly how this one would end. What these young executives didn't realize was that I'd spent 40 years studying how to make audiences feel something. Now I would use those same skills to expose their betrayal. It wouldn't be with my quiet exit. It would be with the most important edit of my career. The flash drive from Zoe became my anchor as I navigated the next weeks, watching patterns emerge that I'd sensed but couldn't previously confirm. Each day brought new coincidences that now formed a clear picture of systematic marginalization. My editing suite, once centrally located where directors could drop in to discuss scenes, had been relocated twice in the past year. First to accommodate collaborative workflow pods, then to optimize space utilization. Each move took me farther from the creative nucleus of the studio. I'd spent my career embracing technological evolution, from the mechanical moviola where I'd learned to cut film as an assistant in the 1980s, through the digital revolution of the 1990s, to today's sophisticated platforms. The narrative that I was resistant to change was particularly galling. My hands traced familiar keyboard shortcuts as I compiled documentation, cut, splice, transition. The movements grounded me, connecting me to decades of storytelling through my fingertips, like returning to a beloved scene that perfectly captured the emotional truth of a film. "You wouldn't believe the processing speed of the new interface," Ryan Matthews explained condescendingly last week, while demonstrating a function I'd been using for 3 years. "It completely transforms how we approach time compression in action sequences." I nodded politely, not mentioning that I'd written a technical paper on digital time compression for the Editors Guild Journal last year. The look of surprise on his face when Zoe later referenced my article suggested my reputation had been carefully curated among newer staff. The term legacy had become code for old throughout Streamverse's communications. Legacy systems, legacy workflows, legacy talent, all requiring optimization, another euphemism whose meaning had become clear through Zoe's flash drive. "You don't understand the pressure we're under to deliver platform-optimized content," David had explained yesterday when I questioned why my last 3 projects had been reassigned. He stood while I sat, a physical positioning I'd begun to recognize as deliberate. The algorithms have very specific engagement metrics that legacy approaches simply can't achieve. I thought back to my early days as one of the few women in editing rooms, fighting for recognition in a male-dominated field. The battles then had been overt, the discrimination obvious. This new erasure was more insidious, cloaked in data and efficiency, perpetrated through seemingly objective metrics that somehow always favored youth over experience. "Vivian," he said, stepping inside and closing the door. "I just wanted you to know I had nothing to do with the Lighthouse reassignment. They told me you had schedule conflicts." A knock at my door broke my concentration. Jonathan Kelly, the acclaimed director I'd worked with on 3 award-winning films, stood there looking uncomfortable. I maintained my expression, years of screening dailies having taught me to observe without revealing my thoughts. "Interesting. They told me you understood the need for a different visual approach." He hesitated. I assumed it was budget-driven, newer editors cost less. But it does seem like everyone over a certain age is being he trailed off. I considered how much to reveal. Have you noticed any patterns in who's being sidelined? His grimace told me everything. I specifically requested you. Your sense of emotional pacing is exactly what this project needs. He lowered his voice. There's something strange happening with all the reassignments lately. Every director I know is being pushed toward younger editorial teams, regardless of their preferences. After he left, I pulled up the email thread from Zoe's flash drive again. The section on content creator demographic optimization included a detailed analysis of salary structures correlated with age and specific recommendations for transitioning high-cost legacy talent that exactly matched what had been happening in our department. Erased? I supplied. That evening, I sat in my home office, surrounded by the artifacts of my career, festival trophies, film posters, photographs with directors who'd become household names. My husband James had been so proud of these accomplishments before his death 3 years ago. You don't just edit film, he'd once said. You edit emotion. They can't teach that in some tech program. The familiar rhythm of decisive cutting that had defined my career now guided my response to this unexpected conflict. I wouldn't fade to black without showing the complete story, not just my own, but the systematic erasure happening around me. I opened my laptop and typed an email to Michael Zhao, accepting his offer to meet. Then, after hesitation, I composed a separate message to Sandra Chen, an entertainment attorney who had consulted on a documentary I'd edited about gender discrimination in Hollywood. The meeting with Michael Zhao took place at his home rather than the studio, a precaution that spoke volumes. His modernist house in the Hollywood Hills featured a private screening room where we'd spent countless hours refining his early films. Today, it felt like a war room. This isn't just happening at Streamverse, Michael said, sliding a tablet across the coffee table. It's industry-wide. I scrolled through a collection of news articles, internal memos, and email threads from various studios. All contained variations of the same euphemistic language: content creator demographic optimization, viewer engagement realignment, legacy talent transition. The pattern was unmistakable, a coordinated effort to push out older creative professionals across Hollywood. The streaming platforms are all chasing the same metrics, Michael explained. They've convinced themselves that younger editors create content that performs better with algorithms, regardless of actual quality. My fingers instinctively made a cutting gesture. They told me my pacing was too deliberate for modern viewers, I said. Yet Jonathan specifically requested me because of my emotional pacing. Michael nodded. It's not about quality, it's about cost. Your generation commands higher salaries and has pension benefits they're trying to avoid paying out. The algorithms are just convenient cover. The revelation hit me with the force of a perfectly timed cut, the kind that makes an audience gasp. This wasn't just age discrimination, it was financial engineering disguised as creative direction. Look at this, Michael said, pulling up an investor presentation. Streamverse promised a 22% reduction in legacy production costs within 2 fiscal years. Their stock jumped 8% on that announcement alone. I thought of my colleagues who had mysteriously chosen to pursue other opportunities over the past year. Gerald, with his encyclopedic knowledge of film history, Patricia, whose sound editing had defined a generation of dramas. Each departure strategically reframed as a personal choice rather than systematic purge. "What's your plan?" Michael asked, studying me with the same intensity he brought to casting decisions. I hesitated. "I've been documenting everything, building a case." "A legal case?" He looked skeptical. "You know how that usually goes in this town?" "Not necessarily," I replied, adjusting my reading glasses. no longer hiding them but wearing them as a badge of experience. More like editing a revealing documentary using their own footage. I explained my growing archive, the contradictory directives, the email thread Zoe had uncovered, the recordings of meetings where David said one thing privately and another publicly. I'm collecting all the raw footage first. The edit comes later. Michael's expression shifted to one I recognized from our most challenging projects. The moment when he saw potential in a difficult scene. You'll need more than documentation. You'll need leverage and witnesses. That's why I'm here, I admitted. I need allies who aren't afraid to speak up. He paced the room, director mode, fully engaged. You realize what you're risking? They'll blacklist you completely if this backfires. The word blacklist hung in the air. Hollywood's most feared punishment. But something had shifted inside me, a reframing as powerful as any revelation scene I'd ever edited. I've edited over 50 films. Michael, I've told other people's stories my entire career. My voice found the authoritative rhythm I'd always used with difficult directors. If this is my last project in Hollywood, it will be the first story that's truly mine. He stopped pacing and studied me, then slowly smiled. You know what makes your editing special, Vivian? You always know exactly when to make the unexpected cut, the one that changes everything. That night, I received an encrypted file from an anonymous email account. Inside was a complete executive presentation outlining Streamverse's talent refresh initiative, with explicit directives to reduce staff over 55 by 38% within 18 months, with executive bonuses directly tied to achieving these targets. More shocking was a slide titled Messaging Guidelines that provided scripts for HR and department heads to use when transitioning legacy talent out of creative roles. David's exact words to me about portfolio rebalancing and current visual language appeared verbatim in these scripts. My hands trembled as I saved the file, not from fear, but from a surge of clarity, so profound it felt physical. This wasn't just about me or even my generation of film professionals. This was about the soul of an art form being sacrificed to algorithmic efficiency and quarterly earnings reports. I began making precise selections from my documentation archive, assembling a timeline just as I would construct a narrative film, identifying key moments, building emotional resonance, creating a structure that revealed truth through carefully chosen details. The next morning, I arrived at the studio early and found Jonathan Kelly waiting in my editing bay. They're announcing a complete department restructuring today, he said without preamble. Everyone over 50 is being moved to content legacy management. I know, I replied, surprised by the calm in my voice. I've pulled my project, he continued, told them I won't proceed without my original editorial team. I stared at him, genuinely shocked. Directors rarely put themselves on the line this way. It's not just you, Vivian. It's what they're doing to the craft itself. His expression was grim. They're turning filmmaking into content manufacturing, measured by engagement metrics instead of emotional impact. As we walked toward the department meeting, I felt a strange detachment, like watching a pivotal scene unfold from the outside. My documentation was secure. Sandra Chen was standing by. Michael and Jonathan were willing to speak up. In the conference room, David stood at the head of the table, flanked by HR representatives. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Jonathan enter behind me, clearly not expecting a high-profile director at a departmental reorganization meeting. As we took our seats, I noticed something I'd missed before. David's confident expression couldn't quite mask the nervous adjustment of his cuffs, the slight flush creeping up his neck, the too rapid blinking. These weren't the micro-expressions of someone announcing routine changes. These were the tells of someone executing orders he knew were wrong. As you all know, Streamverse is committed to remaining at the cutting edge of content delivery, David began, his corporate cadence carefully practiced. To that end, We're implementing a strategic realignment of our editorial resources to optimize for platform-specific engagement metrics. I watched my colleagues' faces as they processed the corporate euphemisms. Some looked confused, others resigned. The younger editors appeared cautiously optimistic, while those over 50 sat with the still watchfulness of people who recognized the guillotine's shadow. Effective next Monday, we'll be transitioning our departmental structure to align with our content streams. David continued, clicking through slides filled with flowcharts and metrics. Our core content team will focus on new productions, while our newly formed legacy content management division will handle our valuable catalog assets. The division was clear. Core meant younger editors working on new projects. Legacy meant older editors relegated to archival work. My fingers tapped a familiar editing rhythm on my thigh, the unconscious habit that had always helped me focus. This meeting was following a script I'd now seen in the leaked documents, almost word for word. I have some questions about the criteria for these reassignments, I said, my voice carrying the precise, measured tone I'd developed over decades of editorial authority. I deliberately positioned my reading glasses on my nose rather than hiding them. Specifically, I'd like to understand the metrics being used to determine which editors are optimal for new content. David's smile tightened. It's a complex algorithm based on audience engagement patterns, Vivian. I'd be happy to have Ryan walk you through the technical aspects later. Actually, Jonathan interjected, as a director whose work is directly affected by these decisions, I'd like those metrics explained now, particularly since I specifically requested Vivian for my project, citing her superior emotional pacing skills. The room fell silent. Directors rarely involved themselves in departmental restructuring, and Jonathan's status made his intervention impossible to dismiss. David's neck flush crept higher. Of course, there's flexibility for special director requests, but the overall framework is based primarily on age, isn't it? I interrupted, feeling decades of diplomatic caution fall away. Not performance metrics at all. Several heads turned toward me, shocked at my directness. David's expression hardened. That's an inappropriate suggestion, Vivian. Our decisions are data-driven and platform-optimized. Then you won't mind sharing that data, I replied, opening my laptop. Because I've compiled the assignment patterns for the past 3 years, and they show a statistically impossible correlation between age and reassignment. Editors under 40 received 94% of prestige projects, while editors over 55 saw their assignments drop by 78%, regardless of their previous performance metrics. My hands moved with familiar precision as I turned my laptop to display the visualization I'd created. The same skills I'd used to edit emotional narratives, now applied to revealing a different kind of truth. This is hardly the appropriate forum, David began. I disagree, came a new voice. Michael Zhao stood in the doorway. As someone who's brought 4 successful projects to this studio, I think this is exactly the right forum to discuss how creative decisions are being made. The strategic alliance I'd been building was now physically present in the room. Jonathan, a top director, Michael, whose films had earned the studio both critical acclaim and commercial success. Zoe, representing the younger generation who saw through the corporate doublespeak, and me, with decades of institutional knowledge and irrefutable documentation. I've reviewed the presentation Vivian compiled. Michael continued, walking to stand beside me. And I've spoken with 15 other directors who've had their editorial team requests overridden in the past year, all in favor of younger, less experienced, and let's be transparent, much less expensive editor. David's expressions cycled through shock, anger, and calculation. This meeting was intended to discuss departmental structure, not individual grievances. Perhaps we should reconvene when emotions aren't running so high. Actually, I think this is the perfect time to discuss the Talent Refresh Initiative and its explicit directive to reduce staff over 55 by 38% within 18 months, or the executive bonus structure tied directly to achieving these demographic targets. The room erupted in murmurs. David's face went pale. "Where did you—" He stopped himself, visibly recalibrating. "Whatever documents you think you've seen were clearly taken out of context. I have the full presentation," I replied calmly, "including the messaging guidelines script you're currently following almost verbatim." The power dynamic had shifted. I wasn't just defending my position. I was revealing the systematic narrative they'd constructed to justify pushing out an entire generation of film professionals. David glanced at the HR representatives, who looked equally unsettled. "This meeting is postponed," he announced abruptly. "We'll reschedule once we've had a chance to review the concerns raised today." As people filed out, many casting questioning glances between David and me, I remained seated. This wasn't a complete victory, but it was a critical turning point. The moment in every film when the protagonist first demonstrates the power to change the narrative's direction. "This won't just disappear, David," I said quietly when only he and I remained. "I have an entertainment attorney reviewing everything, and directors like Jonathan and Michael prepared to speak publicly about how these policies affect film quality." As we walked through the hallways of the studio, I felt a strange sense of coming full circle. My hands, which had cut countless films, were now editing the narrative of my own professional life, reclaiming agency frame by frame, scene by scene. The confrontation wasn't over, but for the first time since seeing my name removed from the Lighthouse director's cut, I felt the power of my expertise not as a liability to be hidden, but as the very tool that would reshape the story's ending. The executive screening room at Streamverse was designed to impress state-of-the-art projection, perfect acoustics, and plush seating arranged in a subtle hierarchy, with the most powerful executives positioned center back. I knew this room intimately, having presented countless edits here over decades. Today, I would present the most important cut of my career. The week following our departmental confrontation had been a carefully orchestrated campaign. Jonathan had spoken privately with the studio's creative director. Michael had rallied fellow directors concerned about losing editorial relationships they valued. Sandra Chen had prepared a legal framework outlining the explicit age discrimination evidenced in the leaked documents. My contribution was what I did best: editing. I spent 3 days crafting a 20-minute presentation that interwove the leaked corporate strategy documents with recorded statements, assignment data visualizations, and most powerfully, side-by-side comparisons of editing approaches that demonstrated the value of experience-driven emotional pacing against algorithm-optimized cutting. The room was fuller than I'd expected. David sat with the HR team, his expression carefully neutral. The studio's executive leadership occupied the prime seats. Most surprisingly, several board members from Streamverse's parent company were present. Sandra's legal pressure had clearly elevated this beyond a departmental issue. Jonathan Kelly stood to introduce me, his director's authority lending weight to the proceedings. For those who don't know, Vivian Winters has edited 7 films nominated for Best Picture. Her understanding of emotional narrative has shaped some of this studio's most successful projects. Today, she's going to show you something that demands your full attention. As I moved to the podium, I felt the physical transformation that had been occurring gradually over recent weeks complete itself. No more hunched shoulders or apologetic posture. No more hiding my reading glasses. I stood with the straight-backed authority I'd always possessed in editing rooms, but had somehow diminished in corporate settings. I'm here today to present evidence of systematic age discrimination disguised as content optimization, I began, my voice finding the clear, measured cadence that had commanded respect throughout my career. But more importantly, I'm here to demonstrate what this studio stands to lose by reducing filmmaking to algorithmic metrics. I started the presentation noting with professional satisfaction how the room's energy shifted as the evidence unfolded. The executive compensation structure tied directly to age-based staff reductions. The scripted talking points about legacy talent that had been used verbatim in dozens of reassignment meetings. The statistical impossibility of the assignment patterns when analyzed against performance reviews. But the most powerful moment came from my core expertise. I showed two versions of the same emotional scene, one cut by me using traditional techniques, focused on emotional beats, the other edited by an algorithm based on engagement metrics from stream versus platform. The algorithm-driven edit generates more rapid engagement spikes, I explained, displaying the analytics. But watch what happens with audience retention over time and repeat viewing patterns. The data was unequivocal. While algorithm-optimized editing created initial engagement, traditionally edited content maintained viewer investment longer and generated significantly higher rewatch rates. By systematically removing editors over 55, you're not optimizing for the future. You're removing the very expertise that makes your content emotionally resonant enough to stand out in an oversaturated market. The room remained silent as I completed the presentation with side-by-side comparisons of viewer comments on traditionally edited content versus algorithm-optimized material. The difference was stark. Algorithm edits generated initial views, but traditional editing created passionate audience advocates and cultural staying power. You can continue privileging short-term metrics over lasting impact, I concluded, but I suggest a different approach, a formal mentorship structure where experienced editors work alongside emerging talent, preserving institutional knowledge while embracing technological evolution. Not erasure disguised as optimization, but true innovation built on a foundation of craft excellence. The studio's chief creative officer, Angela Mendez, broke the silence. These allegations are obviously concerning, if accurate. She glanced at the company's legal counsel. We'll need to review the documentation thoroughly. All material has been provided to your legal team, Sandra Chen replied smoothly, including evidence that these practices extend beyond Ms. Winter's department to multiple creative divisions. One of the board members leaned forward. What exactly are you seeking as resolution here? Before I could answer, David surprised me by speaking up. If I may, he said, standing. I think we need to acknowledge that the Talent Refresh initiative has been implemented overzealously. A murmur ran through the room. David cleared his throat, the neck flush I documented as his tail creeping visibly above his collar. The directive to optimize departments came from corporate, he continued, but the age-specific targets and executive compensation structure were developed at the studio level. Winter's presentation makes it clear that we've conflated cost-cutting with creative optimization in ways that are both legally problematic and creatively counterproductive. The admission hung in the air, unexpected and transformative. This wasn't the confrontation I'd anticipated. Angela turned to me. What would you propose as a solution, Miss Winters? 3 specific changes, I replied. First, immediate reversal of all reassignments made under the discriminatory framework. Second, a formal mentorship program, pairing experienced editors with emerging talent. Third, a transparent project assignment system based on demonstrated skills and director preferences, not demographic targets. As we left the screening room, David approached me in the hallway. The corporate mask had fallen away, revealing something I hadn't expected to see: genuine conflict. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I didn't design the demographic targets. When those directives came down, I was told my own position depended on implementation. I studied him, seeing not just the antagonist of recent months, but a more complex figure caught in the same corporate machinery that had targeted me. Fear makes editors rush cuts, I replied. It makes executives rush judgments too. He nodded, understanding the parallel. I wanted to be part of building the studio's future. I never intended to erase its foundation. Then help fix it, I said simply. You understand both worlds, the corporate metrics and the creative process. That perspective is valuable if it's used to bridge rather than divide. On my screen was a notification from Jonathan Kelly. The Lighthouse Director's Cut had been officially reassigned to me, effective immediately. 6 months after the executive screening, I sat in my restored editing suite, now positioned at the heart of Streamverse's editorial department. The space had been transformed, not just by my return to a central location, but by the new arrangement of workstations surrounding mine in a collaborative configuration we'd designed for the mentorship program. The Lighthouse Director's Cut had premiered to critical acclaim last month, with several reviews specifically praising the emotional pacing of key scenes. Jonathan had insisted on acknowledging my contribution in interviews, explicitly connecting the film's impact to editing techniques that algorithms couldn't replicate. These transitions aren't just about timing, he told Variety. They're about emotional intelligence, knowing exactly how long to hold a moment to create maximum resonance. That's where Vivian's decades of experience become irreplaceable. My hands still moved through the familiar keyboard shortcuts as I worked, but the motion now carried a different meaning. Each precise gesture represented not just my individual craft, but a lineage of knowledge being actively preserved and passed forward. Zoe sat at the adjacent station, her attention focused on a complex emotional sequence we were refining together. The mentorship program had formalized what had once been haphazard knowledge transfer, creating structured collaboration between generations of editors. I'm struggling with this transition, she admitted, gesturing at her screen. The algorithm suggests cutting here for optimal engagement, but it feels too abrupt emotionally. I moved to her station, my reading glasses now proudly perched on my nose. Remember what we discussed about emotional cadence? Sometimes you need to follow the character's breathing pattern, not the software's suggestion. She nodded, making the adjustment. It's strange. I can see the engagement metrics potentially dropping, but the emotional impact is so much stronger this way. That's the paradox we're exploring, I replied. Sometimes what keeps a viewer watching for those extra seconds costs you deeper engagement that brings them back repeatedly. It's the difference between consumption and connection. The department around us buzzed with a new energy, not just the frenetic pace of production deadlines, but the dynamic exchange between experience and innovation. Editors in their 60s worked alongside digital natives in their 20s, each bringing distinct skills to the collaborative process. The formal program had launched with 12 mentor-mentee pairs. Now, 35 editors across age ranges were participating, with a waiting list of younger editors specifically requesting to work with legacy talent they'd previously been taught to view as obsolete. David had surprised everyone by becoming one of the program's strongest advocates. After our confrontation, he'd faced a choice between doubling down on the discriminatory framework or helping build something better. To his credit, he chose the latter. The metrics were never wrong, he'd explained during a recent department meeting. They just measured the wrong things. We were tracking immediate engagement at the cost of emotional impact and cultural staying power. His corporate language remained, but its substance had transformed. He'd become an effective translator between the executive suite's demand for measurable outcomes and the creative department's focus on qualitative excellence. I turned back to my own project, a training module on emotional pacing for the studio's editorial department. My expertise, once devalued as legacy skills, was now being systematically documented and shared. "Do you ever regret going public with everything?" Zoe asked, as we finished our session. It could have backfired completely. I considered the question, remembering the moment of decision in my relocated editing bay months ago. There's a technique in editing called the decisive cut, the moment when you commit to a new direction that changes everything that follows. Once you make that cut, regret becomes irrelevant. You're simply in a new narrative, That evening, I attended a meeting of the newly formed Industry Inclusion Alliance, a group of senior creative professionals across studios working to address systemic age discrimination throughout Hollywood. What had begun as my personal struggle had connected with dozens of similar experiences across the industry. Sandra Chen updated us on legal challenges to discriminatory practices at 3 major studios. Jonathan and several other directors shared their efforts to reclaim authority over editorial team selection. Most encouragingly, multiple studios had begun implementing variations of our mentorship model after seeing its early success at Streamverse. We're not just preserving jobs, Sandra noted. We're preserving an entire approach to filmmaking that was nearly erased under the guise of optimization. At home, I settled into my personal editing studio to work on a new project, a documentary about Hollywood's evolving relationship with technology, featuring interviews with filmmakers across generations. The concept had already generated interest from several streaming platforms, including, ironically, Streamverse. My hands moved through familiar motions, the physical memory of decades at editing controls, still precise and confident. The screen before me displayed a timeline not just of the film I was crafting, but of a career that had found new purpose in its supposed twilight. The most powerful edit I'd ever made wasn't in any film that bore my name in the credits. It was the reframing of experience from liability to asset, the transformation of an ending into a new beginning, the revelation that what seemed like a final fade to black was actually just the perfect cut to an unexpected new scene. Innovation wasn't abandoning what came before, it was building upon it, frame by frame, cut by cut, wisdom by hard-earned wisdom. That was the story I would continue editing, not just for myself, but for every voice at risk of being systematically erased from the narrative.